All the knights tried and failed. Only a human mechanic could lift the alien princess. The first time Jalen saw the alien princess, she was encased in a pillar of living crystal, suspended mid-air above the cathedral floor. The shards around her pulsed with a dim blue light, each heartbeat of radiance echoing faintly in the air, like a note struck on glass. Soldiers lined the walls in perfect symmetry, their metal armor glinting under the crystalline glow, but none of them dared move closer. They had already tried, each knight, one by one, stepping forth to touch the crystal, only to be hurled back as if struck by thunder itself. The Queen's voice trembled through the echoing hall, her desperation barely hidden. "Who among you can lift her? Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads." Jalen stood behind the rows of armored giants, his grease-stained coveralls dark against their polished silver. He had been summoned not as a warrior, but as a mechanic, the only human technician among the Royal Engineering Corps of the Coalition. He was supposed to inspect a damaged shuttle, not witness a ceremony that felt half ritual, half funeral. Yet something in the room tugged at him, the quiet, unbroken hum of machinery hidden beneath the crystal's song. He had spent his life listening to engines. This sounded like one, slowed to the rhythm of a heartbeat. The princess, if the legends were true, was the last of the Illyrian sovereigns, beings of energy woven into living lattices of crystal. When the war against the void-spawned Vorath tore through her world, she had been struck by some kind of stasis weapon, her luminous body frozen in this form. For 3 years she had remained untouched. Every attempt to move her ended in ruin, shattered tools, burned circuits, men thrown across the chamber like dolls. The knights called it divine wrath. The engineers called it a quantum feedback field. Jalen simply thought it was pain. He stepped forward when no one else did. The hall fell silent, except for the soft crunch of his boots on marble. Whispers rippled among the armored ranks, half disbelief, half insult. "A mechanic?" one knight muttered, his voice thick with derision. The Queen didn't stop him. Perhaps she was too tired or too curious to protest. Jalen adjusted his gloves, squinting at the faint geometric lines etched across the crystal's surface. They weren't random. They were patterns of resonance like stress fractures in metal. He recognized them instinctively. He pressed a bare hand against the base of the pillar. The instant his skin met the cold surface, a flash of light swallowed him whole. He felt not heat but weight, a crushing sorrow that poured into his bones. Images struck him like lightning, oceans of glass, skies filled with fire, a city screaming as it collapsed inward. It wasn't just stasis, it was memory. She was trapped inside her own dying moment, reliving it endlessly. He gritted his teeth and whispered, "You don't have to stay there." Something changed. The crystal's hum deepened, shifting into harmony with his pulse. The blue light softened into white. The energy that had repelled the knights before now coiled around his fingers like mist, curious rather than hostile. The crowd gasped as fractures spread upward through the crystalline cocoon, each crack gleaming like dawn breaking through ice. Then, with a resonant sigh, the pillars shattered. The princess fell into his arms. Her body was impossibly light yet dense with energy, like holding a sculpture carved from frozen lightning. Her skin shimmered translucent, showing threads of light coursing beneath. Her eyes opened, liquid sapphire, wide with shock, and for a moment she seemed about to speak. But the effort overwhelmed her, and she went still again, her faint luminescence dimming to a fragile glow. Jalen barely noticed the stunned soldiers or the murmured prayers. All he felt was the pulse beneath his palm, faint, human-like, impossibly alive. He looked up, meeting the Queen's eyes. "She's not an object," he said quietly. "She's hurt," his voice echoed in the cathedral's high vaults. The knights shifted uneasily, unsure whether to draw blades or bow. The Queen raised a trembling hand. "Then you will tend to her, human. You who could touch her when no one else could. Do what your kind does best. Fix what is broken." They escorted him to the infirmary wing, a place built for flesh and blood, not beings of light. The chamber glowed dimly from embedded runes, flickering like candlelight against the steel walls. Machines whirred and clicked, scanning the princess's still form as she lay upon a diagnostic slab. Every sensor spiked and failed in moments, unable to define her existence. Jalen worked in silence, modifying the equipment with instinctive precision, splicing wires, recalibrating fields. Using his own portable generator as a bridge between human and alien tech, hours passed before he finally sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. The readout stabilized into a rhythmic pattern. Her energy signature was fluctuating, anchored to his own biometric field. She was tethered to him somehow. He didn't understand why, only that every time he stepped away, her glow faded. Every time he touched her hand, light returned. "You've linked with her," murmured one of the palace scientists, awe tinged with fear. "Her lattice recognizes your bioelectric pattern." That night, Jalen sat beside her bed while others kept their distance. Through the transparent panels, he watched the alien stars beyond the citadel spires shimmer like frozen tears. He thought of Earth, of grease-smudged hangars and the smell of ozone, of people fixing things because no one else would. "You remind me of home," he said softly, not expecting an answer. Then her fingers moved. A faint vibration passed through the air, and her voice, fragile, musical, alien, whispered, "Home." "What is home?" Jalen froze. Her eyes flickered open again, light refracting through crystalline lashes. He leaned closer, unsure if she truly saw him or only some echo of memory. "It's where people care enough to bring you back," he said after a moment, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, even when everything else says it's impossible. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but carried the shape of one. "Then you have brought me home." Her hand rested weakly against his chest where his heart still raced. The light from her body pulsed once more, stronger this time, bathing the room in azure warmth. For the first time in years, the citadel of glass felt alive again. Outside the infirmary doors, the Queen watched through the glass partition, eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but calculation. "Keep him close," she murmured to her advisor. "If he alone can reach her, then his species may hold what we have lost." The advisor bowed silently, but his gaze lingered on the human with something darker than admiration. Jalen knew none of it. He only knew that the fragile warmth under his hand felt more real than anything in this world of crystal and light. He didn't yet realize that by carrying her, he had shifted the balance of an empire and awakened a legend that would soon test what humanity truly meant. The next morning began with the palace shuddering under the rhythmic tremor of orbital engines. Jalen awoke in the infirmary chair, stiff and half-numb, to find the alien princess no longer lying flat but sitting upright, her translucent hands resting lightly on the bed's edge. The light within her had deepened, richer now like the glow of sunrise through water. When she turned her head toward him, the movement was almost human, yet impossibly fluid, every motion leaving faint ripples of light in the air. He blinked, unsure if he was still dreaming. She tilted her head. "How you breathe?" loudly. Jalen gave a tired laugh. "That's called snoring, apparently a terrible human habit." He rubbed his eyes. "You're healing." The princess looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Healing," she repeated softly, testing the word's sound. "The process of returning to function, yet I was not made to break." Her gaze wandered toward the ceiling where beams of pale light filtered through the latticework. "This place hums differently. It feels alive." "The Citadel's systems are stabilizing," Jalen said. "Your release must have reconnected the core conduits. Power levels are up across the entire city." He checked his wrist console, the numbers scrolling steady for the first time in years. "Guess you're kind of plugged into everything." She frowned delicately, confusion threading her voice. "Everything? I am linked?" He hesitated. "Yeah, to me too, apparently." He tapped the small implant behind his ear. "Some kind of resonance bridge formed when I caught you. Our energy signatures sync." She blinked, faint light shimmering in her irises. "So you carry me still?" The word struck him unexpectedly deep, and for a moment he had no answer. "Guess I do," he finally said. Outside, the city of glass stirred from its long sleep. Through the wide windows, Jalen could see spires lighting one by one like candles awakening across a frozen sea. Streets that had been abandoned since the war now glimmered faintly, as if remembering purpose. The alien populace, few and scattered, emerged from shelters to stare upward. Rumors were spreading fast. The princess was awake, and the human who freed her was walking beside her. By midday, the Queen summoned him again. This time the audience hall felt warmer, though the knight still stood with guarded posture. The Queen's expression was unreadable as she looked between Jalen and the princess, who now walked unassisted, though her bare feet made no sound against the marble. "You have done what none of my people could," the Queen said, her tone both admiring and cautious. "Yet the bond between you is way unconventional. Explain it." Jalen described what little he knew, keeping the explanation grounded. Overlapping energy fields, a feedback loop stabilized by bioelectric resonance. The court scientists murmured among themselves, clearly both impressed and unsettled. The Queen listened, eyes narrowing. "If your link is genuine," she said slowly, "then your life and hers may be intertwined. Should you falter, so might she." The weight of the statement settled like cold stone in his chest. He looked to the princess, but she was gazing past him, her light dimmed slightly, as if she'd heard and understood. Later, in the observatory dome, Jalen tried to shake the unease. He leaned over a console, recalibrating the city's long silent sensors. The princess stood beside him, fingers brushing the interface. Wherever her touch passed, ancient circuits flickered awake. "Your machines are kind," she said. "They remember your hands." He smiled faintly. "Machines don't forget people who fix them." A pulse of light rippled through the horizon display, an energy surge at the outer rim of the system. His stomach tightened. The Vorath weren't gone after all. "That's a war signature," he muttered. "They're testing the perimeter." The princess's voice softened, almost mournful. "They seek what was lost. My kind, my home." Jalen studied her profile, the shimmer of sorrow in her eyes, the ghostly lines tracing her skin. "Then we'll stop them," he said simply. She turned toward him, surprise flickering across her crystalline features. "You would fight for a world not your own?" He shrugged. "You're standing on it now." "That's close enough." Something unreadable passed between them then, like a chord resonating too deep for words. The bond between them pulsed faintly, visible as a faint filament of light that arced from his wrist to hers, before fading again. She stared at it with wonder. "Your kind is strange," she murmured. "Strange and bright." Night fell, and with it came restlessness. Jalen couldn't sleep. The resonance link kept echoing faint emotions that weren't his. Whispers of grief, flashes of luminous cities gone dark. He found himself drawn back to the observatory balcony, where the alien sky shimmered with auroras. The princess was already there, standing silent against the starlight. Her voice drifted like a song. "These lights were once the breath of my people. Now they are ghosts." He stepped beside her, the cold biting through his uniform. "Back home," he said quietly, "we have a saying, stars don't die. They just wait to be seen again." She turned her gaze on him, the faintest smile curving her lips. "Then perhaps I have been waiting." Her fingers brushed his hand, light, feather-soft, sending warmth through his nerves like electricity tempered by calm. "Do you miss them?" he asked after a while. She nodded, eyes glimmering. "I remember the sound of their laughter in the crystal fields, the songs that bent the air. We believed ourselves eternal. Then came the void. It consumed not just matter but memory." She looked at him. "But you, human mechanic, you touched what even eternity feared." He chuckled softly. "I just saw something that needed fixing." She tilted her head again, that curious gesture he was growing fond of. "Fixing," she echoed. "To mend what is broken with care." Her gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Perhaps your people are the healers we never were." Suddenly alarms blared through the citadel, sharp, urgent tones. The walls shimmered with red sigils. Jalen spun to the nearest console, scanning the readouts. "They've breached orbit," he said. "Vorath drones, small, fast." The princess's light flared bright, her composure shifting from serenity to focus. "They seek me," she said. "They feel my awakening." He grabbed his toolkit, already rerouting power to the defense grid. "Then let's make sure they regret finding you." Her gaze steadied on him, her voice calm amid the chaos. "You would fight with me." He grinned without looking up. "Wouldn't be much of a mechanic if I didn't keep the engines running." She extended her hand, light flowing across her fingers like liquid flame. "Then we fight together." The drones came like a scatter of black beetles shimmering against the pale sky as they dove toward the citadel with lethal precision. Jalen felt the first impact through the floor, an odd, distant tremor that translated instantly into alerts and the smell of ozone. The defense grid shuddered, coughed, and then found its footing as his hands moved in a practiced blur, rerouting power and closing circuit loops that had been dormant for years. Around him, engineers barked orders and worked with the coordinated chaos of a crew trying to patch a leaking hull in deep space. The princess stood at his side, her hands lifted not in command but in rhythm, sending ripples of light that tuned the old circuits like a musician coaxing sound from a stubborn instrument. Her resonance harmonized with his makeshift fixes. Where he soldered, she smoothed, and where she calmed errant fields, his mechanical solutions held steady. They were an odd duet, metal and light, soldering and song stitched together into something that worked. As the Vorath swarmed, small explosions dotted the plaza outside, and glass rained in slow, glittering sheets onto the streets. The knights formed lines at the gates, their blades catching strobe flashes from outside, faces masked by helms and fear. Jalen could see the queen's silhouette through the audience chamber windows as she watched, a rigid statue whose features betrayed calculations more than grief. Her advisors clustered like shadows, whispering about contingency and leverage. For them, every conflict was a bargaining chip. For Jalen, it was a problem with a solution. He scoured the console readouts, counting the drones, mapping their vectors, and tracking weak points that even their advanced targeting couldn't mask. There was always a weak point. That belief, drilled into him in a dozen hangars and 1,000 failed fixes, steadied his hands. "Fire the old pulse cannons," he shouted, and an engineer who knew him nodded and hit the override. Those cannons had been ceremonial for a generation, bronze relics that trilled to mark festivals rather than expel invaders. Jalen's fingers had learned to coax power from relics like they were temperamental engines. The cannons answered with a deep groan, and then a resonant boom that sent ripples through the Vorath flock. A handful of drones spiraled off, shredded by the timed interference. Others, smarter and faster, adapted, shifting altitude and converging on different angles. Jalen adjusted the waveform, his mind working like a mechanic's logic gate. If this fails, then reroute, then dampen, then shield. Sweat trickled into his eyes and stung, but the rhythm of tasks had become a kind of meditation. Each successful break in the drone's formation felt like a sentence solved, a stubborn bolt finally turning free. From his vantage, the princess moved with the composed intensity of someone rooted in centuries, not years. She stretched her hands, and the light that bled from her palms coalesced into fields that deflected incoming shrapnel and eased energy surges. Her presence didn't just add to the defense, it taught the age systems to breathe again. Civilians who had cowered in basements peeped from shattered alleys and watched with a mixture of awe and gratitude. An old man clapped a hand to his chest and laughed, a raw, surprised sound at the improbable spectacle of a human and an alien standing together against annihilation. Jalen caught his eye for a second, and the man mouthed a silent "thank you." That small human exchange steadied Jalen more than any repaired circuit. It was proof that his kind of fixing, hands-on, improvised, stubborn, still mattered in a world of crystal and kings. As the immediate swarm thinned, reconnaissance drones revealed the true intention. This was no mere strike, but a snatch-and-grab attempt aimed at the princess herself. The Vorath sought to cage her resonance and drag it off-world, to harvest whatever power bound her to the citadel and to the system. A cold twist cinched in Jalen's gut. If the Vorath took her, they wouldn't simply conquer ground, they would steal a keystone of the city's rebirth. He thought of the filament of light that had first arced from his wrist to hers, the quiet tether that had kept her breathing. Losing her would mean losing more than a person. It would undo the fragile web of recovery the citizens had begun to rebuild. The knights proposed a frontal defense, massing steel and yelling battle cries that felt older than prudence. The Queen's advisors debated a negotiated withdrawal, trying to find words to place value on lives and heirlooms. Jalen proposed something both simpler and riskier. Use the city's archived transit tunnels and the ancient tram lines. Reroute power through controlled surges and lead a counter-ambush where their knowledge of the Citadel's byways would matter more than brute force. His plan depended on improvisation, local knowledge, and a willingness to move where tradition forbade. The Queen's eyes narrowed. Was it courage or the audacity to trust a human with the city's fate? It was a question she had to answer fast. They moved at dusk when shadows made good cover. Jalen led a small team, 2 engineers, 3 knights chosen for steadiness rather than bravado, and the princess who hovered beside him, luminous and incorruptible. Inside the tram tunnels, The air smelled of old grease and warm metal. Jalen felt in his bones that he was back in a hangar, hands on a console that had betrayed its maker a dozen times. He navigated blind turns and maintenance doors that only someone who had climbed over engines and crawled beneath panels would see. The princess stayed close, her light a constant pulse that touched each wall and made the phonograph-like vents hum in sympathy. At a junction, Vorath sent a wave of recon drones, smaller needle-like seekers that could slip through grates and listen for human breath. The princess whispered through the tunnel in a tone that translated less to sound and more to frequency. The grates shivered and the drones stalled, misled by a melody they could not pass. Jalen grinned at her in the dim. Who'd have thought lullabies would be tactical? They burst into the open, where the Vorath had tried to anchor a capture rig, an ugly lattice of cables and claws suspended between cranes, designed to snare and sling. The rig hummed with stolen energy, pulsing in synchronous waves that tried to mimic the princess's resonance. If activated, it would drag her into a tethered cage and warp the city's own conduits to the invader's need. Jalen worked quickly. He jammed a portable disruptor into the rig's control spool and fed in an erratic waveform that confused the stabilizers. Sparks blossomed and ignited the night in a bloom of blue and orange. Knights charged, and an exchange of blades sparked like flint. Jalen's hands flew, swapping circuits like a speed surgeon, reprogramming ancient logic to short-circuit the rig's locks. Under his fingers, the stolen energy turned confused and then inert, like a temperamental engine finally. Calmed by a steady hand, they freed a net of civilians, tangled in the rig's shredded cables, families with dirt-smudged faces and children clinging to dolls that had once been carved from crystal shards. One woman pressed her hand to the princess's arm in a gesture that crossed species and custom. The princess's light brightened as if healed by the touch. For Jalen, that moment crystallized the truth of what he'd always believed. Tools and hands could rebuild more than machines. They could restore trust. As they led the survivors back through the tunnels, the Queen's voice crackled through a comms channel with a sharpness that cut Jalen's momentary peace. "Be warned," she said. "This battle is not only about defense. Some among the court wish to leverage the princess as a political asset. There are those who would bind her power to their rule." Her words sat like cold lead. Jalen felt the stirrings of courtly games around them, power plays that would seek to handcuff the princess's freedom to a throne. He had not bargained for political calculus when he had extended his hand to catch a falling being. But the city's fragile recovery would hinge on who could shape the story of the princess's return. Would she be a sovereign restored to her people, or a prize paraded for advantage? He looked at the princess and saw reflected in her luminous eyes a dawning comprehension of how fragile agency could be under crowns and councils. When the immediate danger passed and the city's lights steadied, Jalen demanded an audience where truth could be spoken plainly. He stood before the Queen and the court with the quiet audacity of someone who had nothing to lose but the honesty to offer. "She saved the Citadel's heart by being herself," he told them. "You can worship her as a relic, or you can treat her like a life. Hold her as an asset and you'll bind the city to fear. Let her be free and the people will have hope." His voice did not tremble. The court murmured, a mix of outrage, fear, and in fragments, agreement. The Queen's expression was unreadable, but her hand hovered over an ancient signet ring, as if testing the weight of choice. Later, alone with the princess beneath a sky stitched with the scars of combat, Jalen confessed his fear. "I didn't ask for this," he said softly. "I didn't volunteer to be involved in politics or prophecy. I just fixed what I could. Now everything seems to depend on decisions I don't belong to." She touched his cheek, crystalline fingers impossibly warm. "You belong where your hands are needed," she answered. "You have the courage to see broken things and make them whole. That courage is not lesser because it is quiet." He laughed, a short, brittle sound that broke into something softer. "Guess being a mechanic makes me a kind of hero in at least one universe." Their laughter eased the tension for a moment, but stakes remained. The Vorath threat receded for now, but the politics hardened like frost. Alliances needed crafting, defenses needed bolstering, and a plan had to be made for taking the fight to the Vorath before they could regroup. Jalen's mind, always restless, turned to engines and maps and the stubborn conviction that improvisation would win where pomp would fail. He was still a mechanic, grease on his hands, a universe of broken things in his past, and he intended to keep fixing, not because it was grand, but because it was necessary. The princess's fingers curled around his palm, light mingling with the grime of his skin, and for the first time since the pillar shattered, he felt that a purpose had crystallized between them, fragile, luminous, and entirely theirs. The days following the battle blurred into a rhythm of rebuilding. The city hummed with new life, its citizens working side by side beneath a sky still scarred by the memory of fire. Jalen spent every waking hour repairing the Citadel's systems, patching energy conduits, and teaching engineers to think less like caretakers of sacred relics and more like mechanics, who understood that imperfection could still run beautifully. The princess walked among them like a quiet star, her light softer now, less divine and more familiar. Where she passed, fear waned. Children followed her, their laughter echoing off the marble. She listened to each one, learning their words, their small stories. Sometimes she would look toward Jalen as if seeking to confirm that this was what home meant. At first, the Queen's Council resisted his methods. They called his improvisations reckless, his use of human tools disrespectful to the sanctity of Illyrian design. But when Jalen's patched-together power grids outperformed centuries-old systems and his team restored clean energy to the lower districts in half the projected time, their protests faltered. "Efficiency isn't blasphemy," he told them once, crouched in the grime of a vent shaft with a plasma torch in hand. "It's gratitude that something still works." The princess had laughed softly at that, her voice echoing through the conduit like music vibrating through glass. "You give praise in repairs," she said. "My people could have learned that." Evenings brought a quieter rhythm. He would find her in the observation hall, standing before the vast window where the stars rippled like rivers of light. Sometimes she spoke of her people's lost world, the symphonies of their architecture, the way they could shape crystal with song. Other times she said nothing at all, content to stand near him in silence, the faint resonance between them pulsing like a shared heartbeat. Jalen didn't know what to call what they were building between them. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it held that same fragile gravity, a pull that felt as old as loneliness and as new as breathing beside someone who truly saw you. One night, as meteors burned across the alien sky, she asked the question he'd known was coming. "When your war ended, what did your people do?" Jalen thought of Earth's old scars, the deserts where cities once stood, the long years of rebuilding. "We fixed what we could," he said. "Then we learned to live with what we couldn't." Her gaze lingered on him, the starlight refracting through her translucent hair. "Then perhaps that is why you lifted me," she murmured. "Not because you were stronger, but because you had already learned to lift what is broken." Their peace didn't last. The Vorath attacks had been a probe, not a defeat. Fragments of intercepted transmissions confirmed a larger fleet moving toward the system. The Queen summoned her generals, and once again the hall filled with armored figures debating strategy. Some argued for evacuation, others for a desperate counterstrike. Jalen listened, silent, until the princess spoke. "They will not stop at this world," she said. "They feed on despair. If we flee, they will follow the scent." Her voice carried calm authority, yet sorrow threaded every syllable. "My people once tried to hide. It only made the darkness grow bolder." The Queen turned to Jalen. "You have touched our systems as none of us could. If there is a way to defend this city again, it lies in your hands." He hesitated, feeling the room's weight press against him. He wasn't a soldier or a strategist, but he had seen engines survive disasters through nothing but clever rerouting. War, he realized, was just another kind of system failure. "So then we fight smart," he said. "Not harder. I can retrofit the atmospheric generators into EMP towers. We'll create a resonance shield keyed to her frequency." He nodded toward the princess. "If she lends power to the field, we can blind the Vorath sensors long enough to strike their command ship." The room erupted in murmurs, too risky, too untested, too human. But the princess met his eyes and said simply, "We will make it work." There was no arrogance in her tone, only quiet faith. And in that moment, Jalen felt again the same spark that had made him reach for her in the crystal chamber. The instinct that broken things could hold miracles if someone believed hard enough. They worked without pause for days. Jalen oversaw teams on scaffolds suspended high above the city, converting air-cleansing spires into amplifiers. The princess drifted between crews, lending her energy to shape the circuits into harmony. Where his hands built, her light refined. They didn't need to speak much. Their connection had grown attuned to gesture and rhythm, the silent communication of people who had learned each other's pace. When exhaustion threatened to pull him under, he'd feel her presence like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder, steadying him. But not everyone wished for success. Late one shift, as Jalen calibrated the primary emitter, a warning flashed on his wrist console, an overload spike that shouldn't have existed. He traced the fault line through the conduits and found an override signal pulsing from the Royal Tower. Someone was sabotaging the shield. He sprinted through the corridors, his boots echoing on crystal floors until he reached the control hub. There, standing before the interface, was Lord Serath, the Queen's cousin and head of the Knights. His ornate armor gleamed under red light. "You meddle with things beyond your station, human," Serath said coldly. "This link between you and the princess is an abomination. Our world's fate should not hinge on alien corruption." Jalen's jaw tightened. "Your world's fate is already tied to it. You'd rather let everyone die than accept help from someone like me." Serath's eyes burned with fanatic fire. Better extinction than submission. He reached for the kill switch, but Jalen lunged first. They collided hard, metal against flesh, the impact echoing through the chamber. Serath swung with armored precision, but Jalen ducked, years of workshop agility guiding him. Sparks flared as the control console cracked under their struggle. Finally, Jalen caught a live cable and slammed it against Serath's armor. The surge threw the knight back, convulsing. Jalen gasped, chest heaving but alive. He locked the console, rerouted the circuits manually, and sealed the override. When security arrived, he said nothing of heroics, only that the system was safe now. But as they dragged the unconscious knight away, Jalen caught the look of one guard who wasn't surprised. There were factions forming within the citadel, old loyalties cracking under the strain of survival. That night he stood again beside the princess on the balcony. The wind carried the hum of engines and distant voices. "They're afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid of me? Of us?" She looked out over the sleeping city. "Fear is what remains when memory fails," she said softly. "They do not remember what hope feels like." She turned toward him, and the faint glow of her light brushed his face. "But I remember you holding me. That is enough for now." At dawn, the resonance towers ignited. Light cascaded through the city in waves of blue and silver as the newly forged shield came alive. The hum deepened into a tone that trembled through every structure and body, synchronizing with the pulse of the princess herself. Jalen stood atop the highest platform, wind roaring around him, watching arcs of lightning dance between towers like living bridges. It was imperfect, he knew that. Some harmonics wavered, some capacitors overheated, but imperfection was part of his craft. He grinned despite the exhaustion. It was holding. The princess rose beside him, her feet barely touching the metal grating. The air shimmered around her, strands of light connecting her to the spires. "It listens," she whispered. "It breathes with us." Jalen checked his readings, field stability at 84% and rising. "You're doing it," he said, wonder breaking through fatigue. "You're actually doing it." But she shook her head gently. "We are doing it. Your machines remember courage. My voice only guides it." For a moment, amid the storm of power, Jalen forgot the oncoming war. The world around them seemed to sing. Then the sky cracked open. The Vorath fleet arrived in silence, dozens of needle-shaped warships sliding through the upper atmosphere like ink through water. The shield flared as their first volleys struck, turning the heavens into a kaleidoscope of fire. Energy rippled outward but held firm. The sound that followed was not an explosion, but a vast resonance, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath. The defense grid absorbed the impact, translated the kinetic fury into harmonic light. Jalen's readings spiked dangerously close to threshold, but still the system endured. Cheers erupted across the city. "It's working," one engineer cried. For the first time in generations, the citadel of glass stood unbroken under siege. Yet Jalen's instincts whispered unease. The Vorath weren't retreating, they were adjusting. He saw the pattern forming across their fleet's formation, subtle but deliberate. They were mapping the resonance, learning its frequency. "They're adapting," he said, gripping the console. "They'll break through in minutes unless we change pitch." The princess's glow brightened as she understood. Then let us change it. Together they retuned the field, a dance of motion and mind, Jalen adjusting phase coils, the princess altering her harmonic pulse. Each change cascaded across the network, reshaping the light around the city into a shifting aurora. The Vorath's next strike hit and rebounded, scattering their formation. The feedback shockwave tore one of their ships in half. Gasps filled the control deck. The impossible had happened. They had turned the invaders' power back upon them, but victory carried its own cost. The resonance link between Jalen and the princess began to burn too bright. He felt his muscles tremble, his heartbeat sinking violently to hers. Pain flared behind his eyes like molten glass. "You're overloading," he gasped. "You're feeding too much into the field." She looked at him, her face radiant and calm even as arcs of energy crawled across her body. "If I stop, they will break through. If I continue, the link will destroy you." He tried to laugh, but his breath came ragged. "Then we find a third option, because those are the rules, right?" She smiled faintly. "You make rules where none exist. That is your gift." Her hands cupped his face with infinite gentleness. "But I cannot bear to see you fall for me again." Before he could protest, she drew in all the resonance around her, an ocean of light folding inward, and severed the link. The pain vanished instantly, leaving only emptiness. Jalen staggered, reaching for her, but she was already ascending, her body dissolving into pure brilliance that streamed upward into the shield. The sky ignited as her energy merged with the towers, amplifying their song 1,000-fold. The Vorath fleet reeled. Their sensors overloaded, their navigation collapsed. Ships spun wildly, colliding with one another in chaotic bursts of light. The Citadel's defenses surged to full strength, hurling harmonic waves that shattered the enemy formation. Within minutes, the invasion fleet disintegrated, some vessels fleeing into the void, others burning out like dying stars. The battle was over. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The shield dimmed, its light retreating until only faint traces lingered across the spires. Jalen dropped to his knees, chest heaving, eyes locked on the empty space where she had stood. "No," he whispered. "No, not like this." He stumbled forward, ignoring the shouts of engineers calling his name. He ran through corridors filled with the echo of fading resonance, up spiral stairs to the observation deck, where dawn was just beginning to bleed into the alien sky. There in the center of the platform hovered a single shard of crystal, small, translucent, pulsing weakly with light. He reached for it with trembling hands. The moment his fingers touched the shard, a voice whispered faintly in his mind, "You fix what you love. And through you I remain." Tears blurred his vision. He laughed, a sound broken and full, clutching the shard against his chest. The resonance was faint but steady. She wasn't gone, not entirely. She had become part of the network, woven into the heartbeat of the city she had once ruled. In the days that followed, the Citadel mourned and celebrated in equal measure. The Queen declared the human mechanic a hero of two worlds. Statues rose, songs were written, but Jalen found no comfort in ceremony. He returned to his workshop, the same grease-stained coveralls hanging from his shoulders, and spent his hours tending to the pulse of the shield, the pulse that carried her. When he touched the control panels, the systems hummed back in gentle recognition, as though greeting an old friend. And sometimes, late at night, when he spoke softly into the empty room, the lights would flicker in reply. Weeks passed. Reconstruction continued. The Vorath threat receded beyond the edge of sensors. Yet one evening, while calibrating a relay tower, Jalen noticed something strange. A soft harmonic pattern emerging within the system logs, a message encoded not in words, but in rhythm. He played it back through an old transmitter, and the melody that filled the air was unmistakable. Her voice singing faintly through the static. "Home," she said within the song, "is where hands remember care." He smiled, the ache in his chest easing at last. The city glowed below him, alive, reborn, breathing through the music of one who refused to be forgotten. He whispered into the transmitter, "Then welcome home, princess." The tower lights pulsed once, twice, as if answering his words. And somewhere in the circuits, in the light between atoms, she listened. In the weeks after the battle, Jalen's name spread far beyond the citadel of glass. Couriers brought messages from distant colonies, praise from worlds that had watched the Vorath retreat, curiosity from scientists eager to study the impossible resonance that had saved a city, yet he wanted none of it. The public called him the Bearer of Light, a title that made him flinch every time he heard it. He hadn't carried light. He had carried someone, and she was gone. The shard of crystal he kept close was both relic and heartbeat, pulsing faintly each night beside his bed. When exhaustion drowned him into sleep, he would dream of her voice threaded through the static of machines, whispering half-formed words that made him wake with tears he pretended were from the cold. The Citadel thrived again, but its brilliance masked fractures. The Queen's Council divided between those who wanted to honor the alliance with humanity and those who saw it as contamination. Some spoke of resurrecting the princess through full synthesis, downloading her energy patterns from the shield into a constructed vessel. Others warned that to attempt it would desecrate what remained of her spirit. Jalen listened to them argue from the back of the chamber, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind him to hide their tremor. They spoke of her like she was a resource, a technology, not a person. He bit back his anger until the meeting ended, then returned to his workshop to drown the noise in work. He had started building something, half ship, half laboratory, an ugly hybrid of human engineering and Illyrian grace. The hull was rough, patched together from spare alloys, but the internal framework shimmered faintly with crystalline filigree. He called it the Promise. It was meant to be a vessel for exploration, or maybe a monument. He didn't know yet. All he knew was that it would be the one place where her resonance could sing without being harvested or analyzed. Every bolt he tightened felt like an act of remembrance. One evening, while welding near the ship's aft stabilizer, he heard a voice behind him. "You're rebuilding her, aren't you?" It was Lisanne, the young engineer who had worked beside him during the defense. She was brilliant, skeptical, and had the kind of sharp eyes that saw through excuses. Jalen didn't look up. "I'm building a transmitter," he said. "One that can reach beyond known channels." Lisanne crossed her arms, eyebrows raised. "You mean you're trying to find her?" He sighed. "Call it whatever you want." The torch hissed and went silent. "She's still there. The shield hums in her frequency. I can feel it every time I touch the controls." Lisanne softened, stepping closer. "And if you reach her? What then?" He hesitated, staring at the faint blue glow in the metal. "Then maybe I can tell her what she already knew, that she wasn't broken." "That we are." Outside, the city continued to rebuild, but rumors spread of new Vorath movements. Scouts reported strange anomalies on the system's edge, pockets of void energy that swallowed signals whole. The council grew nervous. They demanded that Jalen share his resonance models so they could weaponize them. He refused. "You'll turn her song into a cannon," he told them. "That's not what she gave her life for." The argument escalated. Guards escorted him from the council chamber as dignitaries shouted behind him. To the court, he was no longer a savior. He was a liability, too human, too unpredictable. That night, Lisanne found him standing alone on the edge of the airfield, wind tugging at his jacket. "They'll come for your schematics," she warned. "If you're going to leave, do it now." He turned toward her, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "You'd help me?" She shrugged. "You're not wrong. The city's safe because of her, not the council. If she's still out there, maybe she deserves a say in what happens next." Together they prepped the Promise in secret, using maintenance hours as cover. The ship's reactor core pulsed faintly with borrowed resonance, drawn carefully from the shield network, never enough to destabilize it. When Jalen activated the primary drive, the hull sang softly, harmonizing with the same tone he'd felt that night in the sky. For the first time since she vanished, he felt not grief but direction. He didn't know if this journey would bring him to her, but standing still had begun to feel like betrayal. Before dawn, they launched. The city shrank below them, its spires catching the first light like shards of hope. Jalen set the ship's course for the outer rim, toward the void storms where the Vorath had fled. Lisanne managed the controls while he monitored the resonance core, hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. Space unfolded around them, vast, luminous, and eerily quiet. The hum of the engines blended with the faint pulse from the shard in his pocket, guiding them forward like a compass that pointed not to north, but to memory. Hours stretched into days. The void grew darker, swallowing starlight until even the navigation grid faltered. Instruments flickered and died. Only the resonance kept steady, a faint thread of sound that refused to fade. "This isn't space," Lisanne whispered once, watching distortions ripple outside the viewport. "It's absence," Jalen nodded. "The Vorath make homes out of nothing. They hollow out light itself." Then came the first whisper, soft like feedback across a radio channel. "Jalen," he froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable. He turned to the comms display, heart hammering. "Say that again." Static. Then clearer. "You should not have followed." His throat tightened. "You think I'd just sit on a throne of medals and pretend you were gone?" The voice wavered, breaking into fragments. "It is dangerous. They feed on resonance. Your link draws them." Lisanne's eyes widened as the sensors spiked. Multiple contacts. Shapes emerged from the void, massive constructs that looked half machine, half organic, their surfaces rippling like liquid metal. The Vorath had evolved. They didn't just consume light now, they reflected it, turning energy against itself. The promise shook violently as tendrils of darkness lashed toward it. Jalen gritted his teeth, hands flying over controls. "I can't fight them," Lisanne said, panic rising. "Then we don't fight. We harmonize." He routed the ship's resonance core to external emitters. They follow light. "Let's give them a song they can't consume." He adjusted frequencies, aligning the pulse with the shard's rhythm. The air inside the cabin vibrated as if alive. Outside, the darkness faltered, writhing in confusion. The construct slowed, their tendrils retracting. "It's working," Lisanne breathed. But Jalen's console flashed red, core instability. The resonance was burning too fast. "It won't hold," he said through gritted teeth. Then, through the static, her voice again, "Let me guide you." The controls shifted under his hands, responding to invisible input. The shard in his pocket glowed brighter, casting patterns of light across the cabin. A wave of warmth flooded the ship as the resonance stabilized. Not mechanical, but conscious. The constructs retreated, dissolving into motes of fading shadow. Silence returned, heavy and unreal. Jalen slumped back, every muscle trembling. "You're here," he whispered. Her reply came softly, like wind over glass. "Part of me. Enough to find you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the promise settled into a calm rhythm, and Jalen felt that same old pulse, hers intertwined with his own, moving steady as breath. He leaned forward, fingers trembling over the console. "You sacrificed yourself," he said softly. "Why? There had to be another way." Her voice shimmered through the cabin, gentler than before, threaded with light. "Because I remembered what you said. That stars don't die, they wait to be seen again. I waited in the currents of the network, sleeping in the circuits until your hands remembered me." He laughed through the tightness in his throat. "You always did have a flair for poetic timing." Lisanne, still shaken, studied the displays. Her patterns inside the ship now, integrated across every subsystem. She looked between them, half awe, half fear. "You realize what that means?" "She's alive but bound to the promise." Jalen nodded. "So then this ship is her body, and we treat it with respect." The hull pulsed faintly as if in answer, and the sound resonated with something deep inside him, a heartbeat, familiar and strong. For the first time in months, he felt whole. They set a course toward the system's edge, where the Vorath presence had concentrated. The data was fragmented, like listening to echoes in fog. "They've built something," Lisanne said, narrowing her eyes at the radar ghost. "A core structure, massive enough to pull light itself inward." Jalen frowned. "A resonance well." The princess's voice grew sharper, aware. "They mean to erase memory again. If it forms completely, no star in this sector will hold light." The idea chilled him more than any threat of battle. This wasn't conquest. It was erasure, turning existence into silence. The promise entered the distortion field surrounding the core. Space twisted like liquid glass. Stars smeared across the viewport. Gravity flickered in uncertain rhythms, and for a heartbeat the floor seemed to vanish beneath them. "Hold her steady," Jalen shouted, gripping the stabilizer arm. The princess lent power through the resonance core, her song harmonizing against the field's pull. The hull groaned, metal singing under stress, but they pushed through the storm until the structure appeared ahead, a dark sphere suspended in the void, swallowing light. Tendrils of energy spiraled outward, drawing matter into its depth. "That's not just a weapon," Lisanne whispered. It's feeding on memories, the resonance itself. Screens flickered with faint images, faces, cities, voices, all dissolving into static. Jalen felt the shard at his chest pulse in pain. They're eating her, he realized. Feeding on her echoes in the network. He slammed his hand onto the console. We have to stop it. How? Listen asked. You can't fight what's not physical. He met her gaze. Then we don't fight. We tune. The princess's voice grew stronger. Yes, a counter-harmony. If we sing louder than their silence, the void will collapse inward. Lisan's eyes widened. You mean overload it? Exactly, Jalen said. We resonated out of existence. They prepared the system. Cables hummed, relays glowed. Jalen rerouted the main reactor into the resonance array, his hands a blur of motion. You'll burn out the core, Lisan warned. Then we'll make it count. He looked toward the lights flickering across the cabin. You ready? The princess's reply was steady. Always. When he activated the sequence, the ship shuddered, every panel vibrating with impossible energy. The void responded like a wounded animal, its black tendrils snapping outward to grasp them. Jalen held the controls firm, feeding every ounce of power into the frequency climb. Higher, he shouted. Push it higher! The pitch rose until it felt like the air itself was splitting. The princess's voice joined his, pure and luminous, weaving through the ship's howl. Together they built a sound so immense it defied containment. The darkness convulsed. Light poured from fissures across the sphere as the resonance hit its threshold. Now, Jalen yelled. He threw the final lever, channeling the overload through the promise's frame. The explosion was silent, a flash of white that erased all boundaries, leaving only light and a long, endless note. When the light faded, there was no more void. The stars shone again, scattered across the quiet expanse. The promise drifted, its systems flickering weakly. Smoke filled the cabin. Alarms blinked faintly red. Listen coughed but smiled. It worked, she said hoarsely. The readings are clean. It's gone. Jalen exhaled, relief mixing with disbelief. We did it? Then he realized he couldn't feel the resonance anymore. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, she can't be gone again. He searched the console for any signal, any flicker of her light. Silence. Listen placed a hand on his shoulder. Maybe she spent everything to end it. He turned away, unable to answer, his eyes burning. Minutes passed before a faint flicker crossed the main display, an energy signature, small but steady, pulsing from the ship's heart. Jalen froze. The princess's voice returned, softer than a sigh. You taught me to mend what's broken. Now it's your turn to rest. He swallowed hard, voice cracking. Oh, don't get to leave me twice. Her laughter echoed faintly through the static, bright and impossibly human. I'm not leaving. I'm just lighter now. The resonance faded gradually, not in sorrow but in peace. He knew then that she had dispersed herself through the starlight, no longer bound by circuits or form. The void had taken much, but it hadn't won. She had turned her own dissolution into creation. The stars themselves carried her pulse now, a gift no darkness could consume. Jalen leaned back, staring at the viewport where constellations shimmered like crystal dust. You fixed the universe, he whispered. Lisan smiled wearily. Seems fitting, doesn't it? A mechanic and a princess. He chuckled, the sound wet with tears. Guess even galaxies need a tune-up sometimes. They turned the ship homeward. Behind them, the light of the newborn stars spread slowly across the void, touching worlds that had forgotten warmth. Ahead, the citadel waited, rebuilt, alive, and unaware that its heart was now scattered across the cosmos. For Jalen, that was enough. He would carry her story, her song, and her lesson, that humanity's gift wasn't strength or brilliance, but the stubborn refusal to let anything truly end. The shard he still wore glowed once more, faintly a heartbeat echoing across infinity. And when he whispered thank you, the stars answered in kind. The journey home was long and strangely gentle. Space felt less like an emptiness and more like a memory slowly breathing again. The promise drifted on autopilot through calm star lanes, her patched hull gleaming faintly where cosmic light touched the plates. Jalen spent hours at the viewport, elbows on the console, eyes following each shimmer that rippled across the glass. Sometimes he thought he could still hear her, soft chords woven into the hum of the engines, a whisper that asked nothing but stayed near enough to feel. When he spoke aloud, the instruments flickered, like shy nods of agreement. Lisanne worked tirelessly, keeping the ship stable. The overload had scorched half the circuits, and the reactor's containment field sang with a low, fragile pitch. They fixed it the only way mechanics knew, together, improvising with leftover components and hope. She teased him once, smiling through soot-streaked cheeks. "You talk to her more than to me," he grinned faintly. "She listens better." Lisanne rolled her eyes but said nothing more. She understood that the princess was still part of the vessel's breath, scattered through its frequencies like starlight trapped in metal. When the citadel finally appeared ahead, glinting above its emerald world, Jalen felt both relief and dread. Would they even welcome him back? To some, he was the savior of their realm. To others, a reminder that their salvation had come from a human and a ghost. The comm channel crackled alive. Royal transponder codes, clipped voices demanding identification. Lisanne answered coolly. "Research vessel Promise returning from deep field mission. Priority clearance." Silence stretched. Then the gates of light opened, letting them through. Even suspicion could not outweigh curiosity. They landed to fanfare muted by uncertainty. Crowds gathered along the hangar balcony, faces bright with reverence and fear. The Queen waited at the center, flanked by guards in ceremonial armor. When Jalen stepped down the ramp, every whisper stilled. He looked thinner, older, streaks of silver already threading his dark hair, but his eyes carried that same grounded calm, the look of someone who had wrestled with miracles and survived. He bowed his head slightly. "Your Majesty?" The Queen's gaze softened in ways she would never admit. "You returned." Her eyes drifted past him toward the ship. And yet she did not. He met her gaze evenly. "She is in the stars now. But she watches us still." They escorted him to the council chamber again, though it felt smaller than before. Holograms of the system's rebirth flickered around them. New stations, new colonies, the spread of light where darkness had once ruled. "Her sacrifice reshaped more than our skies," the Queen said quietly. "It taught us that strength need not shout." Jalen nodded. She'd like that. But politics had not dissolved entirely. Several councillors pressed for data, demanding copies of his resonance technology. They wanted to rebuild the weaponized shield, to ensure no empire could threaten them again. Jalen refused gently but firmly. "You don't need weapons," he said. "You need memory. Remember what she stood for and you'll never need to fight that way again." His words spread faster than he expected. Within days, apprentices filled workshops across the city, studying resonance not as power but as music, learning to repair instead of destroy. Children carried small tuning crystals that glowed softly when they laughed, souvenirs of a legend that was slowly becoming truth. The Queen, sensing the shift, decreed a new holiday, the Day of Awakening, honoring both the princess and the human mechanic who carried her from darkness. Jalen attended the ceremony, but stood in the farthest corner, hands in pockets, smiling quietly while the crowd sang. When the choir reached the final refrain, a melody built from fragments of her voice, he felt the air shimmer, and a single mote of light brushed his cheek like a kiss. He didn't tell anyone. Some moments belonged only to memory. Later, Lisanne found him on the workshop balcony watching the sun set through the city's translucent towers. "You could stay," she said. "They'd give you anything. A seat on the council, a title, maybe even your own fleet." He laughed softly. "I'm not built for crowns. I fix what breaks and move on." She leaned on the railing beside him. "So what will you fix next?" He looked out where the horizon met the stars. "Whatever's left of the void, there are still broken worlds out there. She'd want them to sing again." Lisanne smiled. "Then I'm coming with you." He started to protest, but she raised a brow. "Someone has to keep your engines from exploding." He laughed, surrendering. "Fair point." That night he returned to the Promise. The ship had been cleaned and restored, her panels shining faintly under the hangar lights. When he touched the hull, a ripple of warmth answered. He closed his eyes. "She's ready," he whispered. Her faint tone hummed back, a note so soft it could have been his imagination. He smiled. "Yeah, I missed you too." They launched at dawn. No royal escort, no farewell parade, just two humans and a ship that carried a soul within its circuitry. The citadel faded behind them, its towers blazing gold in the rising sun. Ahead lay constellations unnamed, regions uncharted, echoes of civilizations forgotten. Jalen set the course and leaned back as the stars stretched into lines. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard laughter ripple through the static, a voice light as glass. Home is where hands remember care. He breathed out slowly. Then let's keep fixing the universe. The ship's engines answered with a steady, contented hum as they slipped into the sea of stars. Weeks passed as the Promise wandered through the restored lanes of space. Each system they visited bore quiet evidence of renewal, mining stations relighting their beacons, refugee vessels venturing from hidden orbits, ruined colonies humming faintly again as power returned. Everywhere Jalen went, he listened, to the engines, to the people, to the thin, lingering vibration that told him the universe was still mending itself. Lisan teased him for it, saying he treated silence like a patient. He only smiled. "Silence talks," he said. "You just have to give it time to trust you." They charted forgotten relay routes, patched emergency networks, left behind small harmonizers tuned to the princess's frequency. Whenever one of those devices was activated, it emitted a tone barely audible, but capable of stabilizing failing reactors or calming wild atmospheric storms. Colonists began calling it the mechanic's blessing. Jalen pretended to hate the title, but at night he kept recordings of each activation, listening to the faint chime that meant one more corner of space was breathing again. Lisan caught him once, eyes closed, head tilted toward the speaker. "Still chasing ghosts?" she asked softly. He opened one eye. Not ghosts, instructions. Months later, they reached the ruins of a station orbiting a dead moon, a field of twisted girders and drifting panels. "This one's ancient," Lisan murmured, scanning the debris. "No survivors." Jalen was about to turn away when the shard at his chest warmed. A pulse echoed through the wreckage, faint but deliberate, guiding them toward a central husk. Inside, suspended in the vacuum, floated an archive core wrapped in crystal veins. When he touched it, light spilled out like water, forming images. Illyrian architects singing structures into being, human engineers laughing over jury-rigged tools, children of both species chasing reflections down luminous halls. The past lived again for a moment before settling into still calm. "She left this here," Jalen whispered. "A memory seed." They repaired the core and anchored it in the station's heart. When power returned, music filled the void, a blend of human rhythm and Illyrian harmony. Lisan grinned. "You just rebuilt a monument." He shook his head. "Not a monument. A reminder." Over the comm, nearby ships responded to the signal, adding their own tones until the entire sector thrummed with living resonance. It was the same melody the princess had sung during the final battle, transformed now into a symphony. For the first time, Jalen realized she hadn't vanished. She had scattered herself deliberately, leaving fragments of hope wherever darkness once lingered. Word spread. More stations awakened. New builders tuned their crafts to the harmony. The border between Illyrian and human blurred, replaced by sound, a shared language of repair. The Queen herself transmitted a message across the stars. "Let there be no more knights who fail, no more thrones that stand alone. Let there be hands that lift together." Jalen listened from his cockpit, pride and sorrow twined so tightly he could not tell them apart. He whispered toward the stars, "You hear that? They finally learned your song." The console lights flickered twice in answer, and he laughed quietly. Years passed that way. The Promise became legend, its crew aging as the universe brightened. Jalen's hair turned fully silver. His hands grew slower but never uncertain. One day he asked Lisan to take the helm. "Time for younger hands," he said. She protested, but he smiled the same tired, gentle smile that had once faced a queen. "I'll still be here. The ship knows my heartbeat." He walked the corridors, touching the walls like old friends, until he reached the observation dome. Stars stretched endlessly before him, each one a note in the endless chord she had left behind. He sat down and closed his eyes. The hum of the engines faded into a softer rhythm, the same pulse he had felt the day he first carried her. In that quiet he heard her again, not as sound but as warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. "You fixed more than you broke." A tear traced down his weathered cheek and he smiled. "Guess I finally did." Light blossomed across the viewport then, millions of tiny flares blooming simultaneously across the galaxy. The harmonizers had synchronized, the universe itself echoing one final chord. It was as if every repaired world, Every restored heart sang her name. Listen found him hours later, still seated, head tilted peacefully toward the stars, the shard around his neck pulsing faintly once more. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered the words he had lived by. Home is where hands remember care. She took the helm alone, guiding the promise into the light, her mentor's laughter still humming through the panels. And somewhere, woven through that cosmic song, two voices, one human, one luminous, sang in harmony again, carrying forward the melody that had saved a universe.